Almost 4 years ago, I uploaded a video that discussed the problems with successor national teams, such as the Czech Republic, Russia, and Serbia, and how it's not always fair for them to inherit all the merits of the nation that precedes them. For example, Russia inherited the Soviet Union's silver medal at Euro 1972, even though that squad consisted mostly of Ukrainians. This video can be considered an unofficial sequel to that, and will go into more detail and thoroughly address the World Cups or European Championships, in which a team from the aforementioned former states is unfairly represented. Additionally, I'm also going to include the Olympics, which I consider to be equal to a World Cup, based on an examination I did over a year ago. It would be great if you check that video out after you're done with this one. At the end, I'm also gonna discuss potential solutions. Now back to the examination. Since I already mentioned the Soviet Union, we might as well start with them. Russians dominated the Soviet squads for the first few major tournaments, but at Euro 1968, other nationalities began catching up, and at the subsequent World Cup, there were just as many Ukrainians. The tables had turned entirely at Euro 1972, as noted before, a tournament that saw the Ukrainian Anatoly Konkov score the winner against Hungary to put the Soviets in the final, which they lost. Despite no longer making up an absolute majority at the 1982 World Cup, Ukrainians were still the biggest nationality in the Soviet squad. Andrei Bal gave them the lead against Brazil, while two of his fellow countrymen, Sergei Baltacha and the legendary Oleg Blokhin, got on the score sheet versus New Zealand. Additionally, a couple of Georgians assured advancement by putting 2 goals past Scotland. Ukrainians dominated the Soviet squad at the next World Cup, where players from Ukraine scored all but 2 goals, against Hungary, which would have been a demolition regardless. Ukraine's World Cup reached a disappointing end in a legendary round of 16 match with Belgium, but the Odessa-born Igor Belanov netted a hat-trick. 2 years later, a majority Ukrainian squad reached a Euro final for the second time in history. Players from Ukraine accounted for every goal except one against England, which would have been won 2-1 either way. Ukrainians were also the biggest nationality at Italia 90, but that's hardly a tournament worth remembering as they finished last, despite the 4-0 demolition of Cameroon, where players from Ukraine scored twice. At the subsequent Euro tournament in Sweden, where the now former Soviet Union competed as the Commonwealth of Independent States, Russians dominated the squad for the first time in decades. But it was again hardly a tournament worth remembering, even though the Soviets did pick up points against the Netherlands and Germany, as they lost 3-0 to Scotland to finish in 4th, just like 2 years prior. Now on to the second team, Yugoslavia, which Serbia have inherited the merits of. At the 1924 Olympics, Croats dominated the squad of Yugoslavia, known as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes at the time. They were obliterated 7-0 by Uruguay in the first round though. 4 years later, Croats were still the biggest nationality, but the Serbs were not far behind. Nevertheless, they suffered another exit in the first round. Serbs accounted for Yugoslavia's entire squad at the inaugural World Cup, where they beat Brazil and Bolivia to reach the semi-finals. 18 years later, Croats were back to making up the majority of Yugoslavia's squad at the 1948 Olympics, where they won silver largely thanks to Croatian goal scorers. You could remove all of the goals scored by other nationalities, only Serbs in this case, and Yugoslavia would still have reached the final. I don't mean to rank on Serbs. They of course played a role in reaching the final too, whether by scoring goals or by other means. I just want to illustrate that it's unfair to only accredit this performance to Serbia. It's a criticism of FIFA for making Serbia the lone successor team of Yugoslavia, but it's not Serbia's fault that FIFA are idiots. Serbs were back to making up the majority of the squad at the 1950 World Cup, where a strong Yugoslav side were only denied a place in the Final Four by hosts Brazil. Croats were back in front by a small margin at the Helsinki Olympics, and had it not been for the combined efforts of them and the Serbs, they wouldn't have beat the Soviet Union in the first round to ultimately reach the final. The demographics were similar at the 1954 World Cup, where 2 goals from a Serb and a Croat respectively secured advancement to the quarterfinals before losing to West Germany. The Yugoslav squads were to varying degrees predominantly Serbian until Euro 1976 on home soil, where Bosnians accounted for just as big a part as the Serbs. There were a decent amount of Croats too, as Yugoslavia finished in 2 blistering matches, albeit losses, against West Germany and the Netherlands. Croats made up the bulk of Yugoslavia's 1982 World Cup team, but it was quite a forgettable campaign that ended with a group stage exit. Euro 1984 was to an even greater extent a similar story, and notably saw both Croats and Bosnians being more represented than Serbs. 6 years later, at the 1990 World Cup, the Serbs were historically poorly represented and didn't score a single group stage goal. 2 Bosnians, Davor Josic and Safet Susic, accounted for half of them, while the Macedonian Darko Pančev and rising Croatian superstar Robert Prosinečki scored the rest. However, the Serb Dragan Stojkovic famously netted a brace versus Spain to secure Yugoslavia a place in the final 8 against Diego Maradona's Argentina, which was narrowly lost on penalties. Serbs were back to dominating Yugoslavia's squad at Euro 1992, which notably had a decent amount of Montenegrins, but not a single Croat. However, Yugoslavia were expelled from the tournament before it began, following UN sanctions due to the breakout of civil war, which is a real shame from a footballing point of view, as they would have been title contenders. I've made a video investigating this actually, which I highly recommend you watch after this one. Now onto this video's final team, Czechoslovakia, whose merits the Czech Republic have inherited. The squads were initially predominantly Czech to varying degrees, but at Euro 1960, Slovaks were in the majority for the first time. Accordingly, their 2 goals at the final tournament were scored by a Czech and Slovak respectively, as they won bronze. Czechs were back in front at the subsequent World Cup. However, 8 years later in 1970, Czechoslovakia's World Cup team was dominated by Slovaks. Unfortunately, they also ended up being dominated at the final tournament by losing every match, despite the Slovak Ladislav Petraš netting twice. Euro 1976 is a particularly curious case. The Czech Antonín Panenka's audacious ship to win the title makes it easy to forget that Czechoslovakia's team was predominantly Slovak. 2 of the 3 goals against the Netherlands were scored by Czechs, but Slovaks accounted for both goals in the final versus West Germany. However, as the official successor team of Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic is exclusively credited with that title. All tournaments after that, up until the dissolution of the country, consisted of majority Czech squads. Most recently the 1990 World Cup, where they enjoyed a respectable run to the quarterfinals. Now that we've established that successor teams don't always fairly represent their predecessors' achievements, how can the problem be solved? If you think medals can be shared between multiple nations, Slovakia should also be awarded a gold medal because of Czechoslovakia's triumph at Euro 1976. If you don't think 2 teams can share a medal, I'd argue it would be fairer to only give it to Slovakia, since more of the players came from there. Then again, the decisive penalty was scored by a Czech, and all of their players gave it their all, just like the Slovaks. I do believe sharing the medal is the best option, if 2 or more nationalities are relatively equally represented. However, Czechs only made up 27% of that squad. Is that enough for them to also earn a medal? At what percentage do you draw this line? The simple answer is that I don't know. If it's over 50%, my answer would definitely be yes. If it's below 5%, then definitely no. The line is somewhere in the middle. This is not only an issue when it comes to fairly allocating silverware, it's also got to do with legacy in general. Just look at this video on FIFA's official channel that tells the story of Russia's supposed golden generation, at a World Cup where the Soviet squad was mostly Ukrainian, including Oleg Blokhin, the Soviet Union's most capped player and all-time leading goalscorer. Hopefully you gained some good insight from this video, and realized that some countries' official World Cup debut dates should be taken with a grain of salt. Remember to like, comment and subscribe.